When I'm standing in the grocery checkout line, I'm always fascinated by the tabloids that are there. I love reading the headlines. And usually what you find out is after you read the headline, and then you open it up to find the article, sometimes the article isn't even in there. It's just the headline to try to get you to buy the magazine. You know, three-headed boy born in Alaska or something. Or there's always somebody coming up with a new theory on the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And there's also then all those people-type magazines. You know, every one of those rich and famous people. How many divorces have they had this week? Or who's being unfaithful to who? Always interesting little gossipy things that we can pepper our minds with. These are the rich and famous people, huh? Today we're confronted with a name for those rich and famous people in a different category. Jesus uses the phrase rich fool to describe them because they got it upside down, totally upside down. They haven't figured out that accumulation is not necessarily the road to happiness. They haven't figured out that in order to truly be happy, one has to be generous and give things away. It's interesting when you do a search on what Jesus spoke about, taught about, what was the most frequent example or thought or teaching of Jesus? And it really has to do, usually somewhere around the idea of generosity. They say he's told more parables having to do with money than anything else. One of the analyses came up with this, that the phrase when Jesus said, if you find your life, you will lose it. If you lose your life, you will find it. Or in another gospel it says, if you love your life, you will lose it. If you hate your life, you will keep it. This phrase shows up in all four gospels, and it is also placed at 4 different occasions during those gospels. In other words, it's not always the same story, not always the same place. So it tells us that in the gospel writer's minds, this was a frequent message on the part of Jesus. This business about finding your life, losing it, losing your life, you'll find it. And it really boils down to the story we have today about the rich fool in the gospel, his parable about him. Everything is mine, he says. Everything is mine. And in the end, Jesus says, where will it all go in the end? Paul in the second reading today talks about kind of a similar thing. He talks about heavenly treasures and how greed for wealth and influence is a kind of idolatry. Therefore, he's placing greed in the category of the most important of all the commandments. The commandment that denies God in your life. It's not the first commandment by mistake. It's the most important of all the commandments. And so when Paul talks about greed being an idolatry, he's talking about breaking the first commandment. Now the key to breaking this cycle in our own lives or in the life of the world is for us to take a look at that ancient teaching of stewardship. Stewardship is not just a matter of giving back because you owe somebody else. It's giving back because it wasn't yours in the first place. It's not ours. We're only here using what we have for the sake of our families, for the sake of our community. It's not mine in the sense of it's been God's gift to me from the beginning. Stewardship, when it comes to your notion about owning land, I know is still a thought in farmers' minds when they think about the fact that they're going to give that land to another generation. And so they don't want to waste the land. We want the land to preserve the next generation. That's what stewardship is all about. Realizing it's not yours. It belongs to all of us. I reflected on this notion for some time now about the whole notion of how does a church, how does a parish get its financial stability? How does a business get its financial stability? 2 different ways of doing it. It's always been our history. 2 different ways. When it comes to a business, you know, you want to have enough profit so that you can put money away so that you can repair and replace the things that you're using up. So that the depreciation that goes on is going to be able to be recouped at some point in time when you've got to replace that machinery or replace that building. and yet have enough profit over and above that to be able to make a living. When it comes to the church, guess where that depreciation ends up? Or in a sense, guess how that's compensated for? Not by us putting away money, not by making money, but it's by having a parish full of people that are very much committed to their own stewardship. And so you recognize, this is a community you'll want to be a part of, and you want to make it your own, and therefore you contribute to making it alive. That's where the strength comes in parish finances. It isn't that we don't use good business practices in parishes. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is our strength as a parish comes from the people that call this their parish. So a living church made up of living members, that's the basis for a kind of financial stability in our parish, in our lives. Another way of looking at this is years ago, our Catholic schools were staffed by sisters, nuns and priests, mainly nuns, really. Now, they didn't get paid very much. They were the endowment fund back then. And we benefited from their work, but they're not there anymore. So we have to find other ways to support our community and support our schools. And so we do things like give away pickups or trucks or whatever they call it today, that big red one that's out front. And so we contribute because we believe it's mine. In other words, this is my parish, this is my school, and I want to preserve it for the next generation. So there's lots of ways to look at this business about trusting God and keeping Him at the first, keeping Him first in our lives, and recognizing that what we have is a gift from Him. Dr. Carl Menninger, who founded the Menninger Psychiatric Institute in Topeka, Kansas, and when I did some research on this, I found out they moved. They're no longer in Topeka. They're now in Houston. Thank you, Obamacare. But anyway, long and short of it is, they moved their whole operation down to Houston. But anyway, Menninger started this whole process of helping people through their psychiatric problems. And in one of the little incidents that he relates, he was counseling an individual who was very, very wealthy and very, very unhappy. And he says to him, well, what are you going to do with all of this money that you have? And the man says, I'm going to worry about it. Does that give you a lot of pleasure? No, that doesn't give me any pleasure. But it's an absolutely terrifying thought for me to think that I would give any of it away. Menninger responded by saying with his quip, it's interesting. Generous people are rarely mentally ill. Even a kind of proper way of surviving, of being healthy, even includes generosity. Now there's all sorts of ways for us to be barn builders, to use the phrase from the gospel. There's all sorts of ways to be barn builders. First of all, you might have no time for God. I'm too busy to pray. You might have no time to stick around to the last verse of the song at a Mass. I am too busy. I've got things I got to do. You might have no time to volunteer. You might say to yourself, I just don't want to get involved. Builders of barns of time. There's all sorts of ways to be a barn builder. Maybe it's no thought for that sick neighbor. Maybe it's no sense of wanting to share in the community's activities. Maybe there's no feelings even I have of gratitude for what I do have. A barn builder of talent. You put things away, never to be used. Or maybe I've not made any plan for my own personal estate. Or maybe I've never even increased my envelope giving since 1965. Builders of barns for possessions and money. There's lots of ways for every one of us to be barn builders. I think about all the stuff that I had to pack up before I came here. I'm thinking I got a barn full of stuff. I haven't figured out how to give it away yet. And I'll get there. Where will all this hard-earned accumulation go? Jesus was confronted by that man in the gospel today who says, tell my brother to give me my share of the inheritance. And Jesus uses it as an opportunity to talk about greed. But it's interesting to look back at Jewish law when it came to inheritance. It seems that if you had two sons, that the first son, the oldest, would get 2/3 of your property, and the second son would get 1/3 of your property. It's not the way we think of things today. At least that usually we treat everybody exactly the same. But what's interesting is the law had nothing to do with the women. They got nothing. And they got nothing because what? They married into that wealth of some other family. And so it was always important to try to get your daughters married to somebody who could really good take care of them well. And so the fathers were usually pretty protective of how their daughters ended up. But nonetheless, what happened was that this man was probably telling Jesus, my brother isn't distributing the inheritance. Tell him to get on the stick and do it. Or maybe he's upset with the distribution in the first place. But Jesus uses an opportunity then for us to reflect on greed, on possessions, on how important our time is, and trying to get us to maybe convert just a little bit to that notion that everything we have is God's gift to us, and we only possess it for a time, and then we've got to hand it off. You know, prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, these three words that we often hear during Lent, actually go back to Jewish days. Because the teaching basically was if you had a very good harvest, you were supposed to give more of it away to the poor. You should have left more in the field for the poor, the immigrant, and the slaves to be able to accumulate some of their own. It's interesting that in that story that Jesus had there, about that man who was going to build bigger barns, the word I shows up 6 times, and the word my shows up 4 times. He was completely selfish and totally turned in on himself. When we make our baptismal promises, we reject that, because that's what the devil wants to do. He wants us to believe the big lie. The first lie is that we don't need to pay any attention to the less fortunate. Because why? It's all mine. And the second lie, this world's going to last forever. We often don't want to think about our own death. And the third lie, everything I have is caused by me. Those are the lies that we need to reject as we renew our baptismal promises. So I end with a little story about a guy who found that bottle, that proverbial bottle on the shore, right? He opened it up and the genie comes out. I'm going to grant you 3 wishes. He says, I've been thinking about this. If I ever had this happen, I have already the 3 wishes in mind. First of all, I want $1 billion in a Swiss bank account. And the genie says, poof! And he had in his hand the document that gave the account number at the Swiss bank and the $1 billion that he had in it. Pretty good deal. Next thing he said, first thing I said, I want a brand new red Ferrari. And that $100,000 red Ferrari appeared right there in front of him. He was pretty tickled. Finally, he asks the genie, I want to be irresistible to women. And the genie says, I can do that. Turned him into 2 diamond earrings. I think there's a lesson